newspaper columnist, author, playwright, and songwriter. Was born in Castlereagh, Roscommon, that's Gaelic, I'm sorry, in the west of Ireland in 1955. He began part-time work as a journalist in 1981 with Hot Press, Ireland's leading rock and roll periodical, becoming a full-time journalist with the paper in '84 when he moved to Dublin. He has been a columnist with the Irish Times, Ireland's leading quality daily broadsheet since 1990, and currently also writes columns for the Irish Mail on Sunday, the Irish Catholic, and Traccia Traces, the international magazine of the Catholic movement, Communal Liberation. I would only add that John is a dear friend, same age. I keep repeating that, but it's a fact. And I've had the joy to write a beautiful song with him, which you can buy. There's a fantastic CD up there at the book table. It will support the New York Encounter. So a touch of beauty and a big help to the New York Encounter, a beautiful song. And I'm very happy that he's here with us because his lifetime journey was a serious one. Dramatic, beautiful, filled with sadness, longing, joy, real life. So without further ado, John.
Thanks, Vero. Thank you very much. I don't intend this in a gushing way, but because I know when people come to speak in a place, they always praise it. But it's not my intention in that sense. But to be in Manhattan is really an extraordinary thing for me. I can't tell you, the excitement I feel to stand outside the door of the hotel, the New Yorker hotel, and look across the street and hear the noise. That really, there's an excitement in the city, in the street. I mean, I think, these are the greatest streets in the world. And to be here is kind of a really extraordinary experience. One that could overwhelm you if you didn't kind of have a little bit of knowledge of stuff and Giussani and all that stuff. Because the thing about the street is it's the excitement that it has is a kind of an excitement of man's world, really. There's a promise there of opportunity, of hope, of excitement, of rhythm and sex. All of these things are there in that encounter with the street. And even though I come from a small town in the west of Ireland, 2,000 people, in a certain sense, existentially, I come from the same kind of place. I mean, this is the best street. I come from a slightly lesser street, but it was still a street. And so you walked out your front door and you were on a streetscape. And you were in a world that really had excitement and promise, noise, motion, but also a kind of an order that really unconsciously it told you what to do. It kind of directed you left or right, or there were lines and corners and angles, and everything was relatively clear. A modern streetscape has the lights and the walk, don't walk, all that stuff. And so that existentially there's a certain kind of condition that comes with being in a street. And I love streets in that way because I was born on one, and they're in my soul. And that's kind of, part of what I want to say. But when I went out my back door, I walked out into really what was a wilderness, because all of the gardens behind our houses had all run into one through basically laziness, I guess. And they were overgrown with massive weeds and hawthorns and sycamore trees dotted all over the place, and then at the bottom a river and an island on the river, which you could get onto by a felled tree, and you could stay there all day and get lost. And I used to do that as a child, get lost in this wilderness. And at a very early age, I think, I had this awareness of two different realities, the street and the wilderness. the street which kind of told me what to do, the wilderness where I was completely facing something great, something enormous, something that made me. Even in that kind of that space relatively close to the street, I had that. And it sort of somehow, I suppose, really entered my soul as well. I think maybe that there's something not unique, but special about that experience, because it gives you a sense, I think, of what the modern world is really like, because we have those two possibilities. I remember actually, we didn't have TV in my house when I was a child, but I used to watch TV in the house of a neighbor, a guy who was a shoemaker called Ned Rock, and he had polio, so but he loved to fish, and I used to dig his garden and get some worms for him to fish with, and in return he would let me watch TV. And I used to watch Hawaii Five-0 and all that stuff. Thank you for that. That was part of my culture. And I remember the day of the moon landings. I mean, of all the things I ever wanted to watch on TV, I wanted to watch the moon landings, and I knew they were coming, obviously. But the day that they were happening, some visitors arrived unexpectedly to Ned Rock's house, so I couldn't go. So I was walking around the wilderness thinking about these guys. And there was one tree that I hadn't climbed in that place, one sycamore, which is a lot higher than the others. And I decided that in recognition of what was happening on the moon that day, I would climb the tree. So I got to the top of this tree and I kind of waved upwards. That was as high as I could get, as close as I could get to the moon, and I waved and said, "Good luck, boys." So the wilderness and the city. Now, you got to think about this, because in the Bundestag in Berlin in September 2011, Pope Benedict made an extraordinary speech, very simple speech in a way, but one which kind of had at the heart of it an image which I think is probably the most useful and effective image for us in understanding our culture and our existences in this age. He spoke about the bunker that man has constructed for himself to live in, without windows, in which the logic is the logic of positivism, the language of positivism. And I've been carrying this image around with me for a while, and I've been, gigging it around Ireland, and I've been improvising around it. So now the bunker is kind of I put up some wallpaper and some pictures, and I've added to it a little bit, but I've interpreted the Pope's intention, because I think it's an extraordinarily powerful image. When I heard it, I said, this is it. This is exactly the way. What we need to do is make visible the condition that we suffer from. And the Pope's what he was saying was that we people, we human beings, have constructed a reality which is partial, which we live in because we've made it and we understand it pretty much completely, and it all makes sense to us. It's coherent within itself. But it shuts out all the things that we find confusing or problematic, or that don't, that sort of make us uneasy perhaps, or don't add up for us, or whatever it is. So we've reduced our reality to what we can actually comprehend and explain, and that which is coherent to us. And we've shut out the mystery. And this to me, was really a wonderful image for my reality, my life, because I've been telling various aspects of my life before, but I hadn't really understood them in this way, because the metaphor can be extended in all kinds of directions, and it applies to everything. It applied to my life. I mean, for example, many times before I've told the story of my life, really, in a particular way, and as a narrative, and I'll tell a short version of it now in a moment, but I hadn't ever understood it quite in this way, as life in a bunker, as life in a fabricated reality, a partial reality that had actually shut off from me the nature of myself and the nature of reality. So, to tell you my story, I was born, as I've said, in the west of Ireland, in a small town, in a very Catholic context, very intensely Catholic context. I've often said that I didn't have faith, I didn't have belief, because there was no necessity to have these things. how can you need faith when you know that God exists? It isn't faith, it's just knowledge. You just know. And that was the way I was. It was second nature to me. Christ was with me all the time as a child. He never left the room. I spoke to him all the time. He was with me every step I took. And in a cultural context, the church was at the center of this town, down one street, up another. And there it was. And that was the center of our reality. Because on the way to school, we would go in and say a prayer. On the way home, we would do the same. In the evenings, I would go with my father to, say, the Stations of the Cross, or maybe go to a men's sodality or something like this. And the Gospels, like in the Mass, they seeped into our bones. The stories, they became us. I remember once the Irish writer John McGarren saying that the church was his first book. And I didn't quite know what he meant, but I kind of do now, that the church gave him a version of reality that was really essential for his growth as a human being. And that, when you think about it, it was impossible. It would be impossible to imagine life without this book, without this understanding of reality. But then something happened. And it was kind of about this early 70s when the 60s arrived in Ireland. And there was a great moment of really, it was like, what's this? This is incredible. Because Ireland had been a very kind of perhaps grey, conservative place, very, not a fun place maybe. Maybe it's certainly not, I'm sure it was nothing like it's portrayed as now, but suddenly there was this, influx of sound and image and ideas, music, rock and roll, radio, television. And even though we didn't have television, I kind of, on Ned Rock's television, saw a lot of this stuff going down, and I wanted some of this. And gradually I found that there was a kind of a sense of tension between the reality that I'd grown up with and this new reality. There was like a promise coming to me that, it wasn't just that there were two realities, but there was like a choice to be made between these two. That I couldn't, they were incompatible, it seemed. Certainly on the basis of the model that had been given to me of Christianity, which was in Ireland very dark and forbidding and not a whole lot of fun in many ways. And now, I've been struggling with these things over many years, talking about them in public and trying to articulate, because, in all these discussions, you have to tiptoe around like in a minefield, and because somebody will jump, at the wrong, you say the one word and you're into a different meaning entirely. So I kind of go around these a little bit like, the oyster going around the grain of sand or whatever, but I remember one day I was talking about this, and a friend of mine from Ireland, Maura Biondi, who was responsible of the Dublin movement in Dublin, came up to me and said, what you were talking about there about freedom, this choice. He says, Giussani once said, given a choice between salvation and freedom, I will always choose freedom. And that was like, for me, sensational idea. That my freedom was something good. That it was something that was part of my salvation, that I couldn't, in a sense, have salvation without freedom. That salvation wasn't something that could be forced upon me. It had to be my choice. I had to want it. And therefore, I had to have freedom to get it. And that was completely, not what Irish Catholicism was telling me. It told me that my freedom was a problem. My desire was a problem. And here, struggling with these ideas, I kind of had a clue at last to something. And in a way, this has been my journey, gathering a series of clues and putting them together, trying to work out what's going on here. Because there is something going on. I think for a long time, I thought my life was just a random set of circumstances. But now I know that there's something going on all the time. There's a pattern, there's a story, there's a narrative, there's a drama. And so I started to, later on, put all this together. But meanwhile, back then, it was very stark. You choose Christ or freedom. Imagine that, Christ or freedom. Because I had this idea, if I go off on this, 60s path, and the rock and roll and all that kind of stuff, sex, drugs, and all the rest of it. You know, Christ, he's a nice guy, but he's not going to want to be hanging around that kind of stuff. So, you know, I'm going to slip away, first chance I get. You know, and so I wait for him to fall asleep, and I'm gone. And off I went on this voyage of freedom. And I want to tell you briefly about that, because I often talk about this, but it's just to kind of put together in one little box this story, because it's a big story. But the story of my relationship with alcohol tells it pretty much all, because it actually is a story in itself, and it's also a metaphor for the rest. The first time I picked up an alcoholic drink, it changed my life in every way. It made me whole, I thought. That was first after 2 drinks, I was all the problems I had were gone. All the difficulties, all the inadequacies slipped away from me. All the inhibitions. You know, I could talk to girls now. I could dance. And so I thought, oh, this is great stuff. This is kind of like the missing part of me. This is like something that, you know, maybe back in the hospital when they were sending my mother back with the baby back home, they just gave her the wrong bottle. And this stuff, this was really good stuff. So I thought this, you know, you might think it's a bit awkward that if you want to be yourself, you have to tank up. But actually, it didn't seem like a big problem to me. It's a bit like, you know, putting gasoline, as you call it, gasoline in your car. You know, you just need to remember to put it in, make sure the tank doesn't go too empty. And away I went. And that went really great for a few years. You know, I don't want to slag it off because, you know, it did a lot of what it said on the 10. You probably don't recognize that expression. But but then something started to happen. Something entered in, and a twisting kind of occurred in me. And I found that I wasn't able to get to that pitch. Because I had this sense that actually I wanted something, and this stuff gave it to me, almost. That maybe, you know, I'd take up the first drink was kind of pretty rudimentary, you know, when you just kind of got it into you. And then you took the second one, you started to kind of feel something. But then the third one, somewhere down about halfway down the third glass, you kind of felt, oh yeah, I'm nearly there now. But then you take another sip and you're gone. And that happened again and again. But now I found that I couldn't keep even that balance, because I needed different concoctions, different mixtures, more of one, you know, and it just still wasn't getting it. And I would find that whereas previously it was a very joyous experience, now it turned very dark. You know, and I mean, if you'd seen me, if you had a CCTV camera image of me in those days coming from work on a Friday evening at 5 and heading for the pub, O'Donoghue's in Merrion Row in Dublin, great music pub, and you would see me skipping down the street, I'm sure. I would be skipping. But then when I would go in for an hour or two, and I'd be trying to find that spot, and it wouldn't happen. And then the darkness would descend around me, and I would look around, and it would be like I was in hell, really. I mean, there would be faces of people I knew maybe or didn't know, but there would be like gargoyles around me. And I just have to run out of that place. And this, you know, this isn't healthy. And so I started to you know, really be aware that there was something happening here. Anyway, to make it somewhat short, this went on, and I reached a point where I couldn't go any further. I reached really a cliff edge in myself, where I realized this couldn't go on. Something had happened. I didn't know what it was, but it wasn't working, and it wasn't me, and I couldn't find myself anymore. And so I ended up here, not wanting to be here, not wanting to stop drinking, but thinking, I don't know. So I was lucky. At this point, when I reached this point, I met some people who had been along the path before, and who talked to me about my condition. And these were guys. I'm talking about Alcoholics Anonymous. I'm not being coy about it. These guys started to talk to me about where I'd come from, and they told me their own stories, which were very like mine. And they started to talk to me about things that then were hugely uncomfortable and unexpected, like God. I mean, I had spent 20 years out there really not wanting to know about God, having walked away from Christ in the night, really not wanting to And it's not that I had become a militant atheist or anything. It's just that I had become indifferent. I had become numb to the idea of God. And so they started, and so when they started to use words like God, I reacted against it very much, because I immediately thought, these guys are saying to me, look, you've had your fun. You've front-loaded your fun now. It's time to, get on your knees, boy, and pray, and stay out of trouble for the rest of your life. And I seem to have a lot of life ahead of me, and that wasn't much of a prospect, but then they gave me a book, which is called Alcoholics Anonymous, but they called it the Big Book, which had all of the feel and weight and texture of a Bible. And I was flicking through this book the first night, and I came across this chapter title, which was We Agnostics. And I didn't read the chapter straight away, but I started thinking about this title. How can people who wrote a book about alcoholism address the reader as a fellow agnostic? I mean, I want to know what this meant. I want to know what do you mean by this? What's this about? So I asked about, and they started saying, look, what you suffer from is a spiritual disease, a disease of the spirit. And essentially you have, and they explained it in different ways, from different angles. One was my desire. They said, you have misunderstood your desire. You have thought that your desire was this stuff, not this stuff, but something like that. Different color, most of the time. And your desire is for something great and infinite and that you can't find. It's not for this stuff. And they said, you have denied your structure. You've denied your origin. You've denied your nature because you are a created being. You didn't make yourself. You didn't just happen to be here. You're created. And you've tried to pretend that didn't happen. And you've pushed God off the throne in your life and taken his place. And you know what happens then? You end up with all the responsibility of God and none of the power. And that creates fear, terror. And the only solution for terror, more of this stuff. And so this goes on. So they started to give me maps of myself, which were completely unexpected and completely at odds with the kind of version of my condition that you might have picked up outside. Where you get a kind of a medical analysis, a pathological analysis, psychiatric analysis, mechanistic analysis. They were saying, no, you have misunderstood yourself and reality. But it's okay. If you can reorientate yourself to that star, what that we call God, then you'll come back in tune. And I thought this was kind of implausible, but I didn't have many other choices, so I stayed with it. And it became an interesting journey, an interesting voyage. And there are various episodes which I've told, and forgive me if you've heard some of them before, but some of them are kind of, they're quite important to stress. I mean, one of the things with prayer, I couldn't pray. I didn't, I realize now that as a child, I never really learned to pray, although I learned lots of prayers. I just said them off by rote, and I remember actually if I was saying the rosary on my own, and I lost count of the Hail Marys, I'd have to go back to the beginning. So I could never finish a rosary on my own. I was constantly going back to the beginning. And that was the kind of idea of prayer I had. But these people were saying, no, listen, really you need to say 2 prayers in the day. Because they were really insistent upon keeping everything in the day. And it wasn't that you cling on to your life or your sobriety for another 24 hours. It was sufficient unto the day. Manage what you have to do today. Get through it. Tomorrow's another day. So there are 2 prayers you need. One is in the morning to ask for help, and the other is at night to say thanks. And if you want to make it just those 2 words, that's fine. Help, thanks. But then I was sort of working along with this, and then one day, a guy was asking me, as I used to do, how are things going? And because they really, this is the thing. It's the first time I really met people who really cared how I was, and who asked me the question. And this is true of the movement of CL as well. When people ask you, and it surprises me still in CL as well, because it's a particular thing that when people ask you how you are. I mean, back home, when people ask you how you are, they don't want an answer. They're gone. But these people, NCL people, kind of think they're serious. How are you? Oh, you want to know? Okay. Are you a doctor? So this guy said to me, "Hi," and I said, "Well, it's okay." He says, "Is it better?" I said, "No, worse." And he said, "Well, what do you do?" I said, "Well, do you pray?" "Yeah, I do, yeah." "And how do you pray?" And I said, "Well, when I'm getting up in the morning, I brushing my teeth, I pray, and so on." And he says, "Have you tried getting on your knees?" I says, Nah, I couldn't do that." You couldn't do it? No, I couldn't do it. It's not possible. Why not? "Well, my knees won't bend." Oh yeah, we're familiar with this. And it is actually a symptom. I don't mean it absolutely literally, but almost absolutely literally. There's a symptom of coming through the age that I'll describe. And I'm talking about life in the bunker, remember. That if you live in the bunker and live by the logic of the bunker, something of it seeps into your DNA and actually infects your joints. So I couldn't bend my knees to pray. He says, "We're familiar with this, but we have a solution. Tomorrow morning when you're putting on your shoes, take one of them and throw it under the bed. And you'll find that you have to get on your knees to retrieve it. And when you're down there, say your prayers." And that's what it took to get me on my knees. But the thing was that when I got down there, I thought, hey, this isn't so bad. Nobody can see me. Maybe he can see me, I don't know, but it's all right. I don't mind so long as nobody else can see me. So long as between the two of us, And it's a bit nonsensical, but that's kind of the beginnings of the journey for me. And then after a while, people would come to me and say, "How's it going?" And I'd say, "Actually, it's better." I could say that genuinely. My life was now, as they said, manageable. I wasn't terrified anymore. I could live a happy day and look forward to the next one. I didn't need alcohol to support me in this. And I found that actually my life was becoming better than it had been with alcohol, which doesn't sound a lot, but actually it is. For the alcoholic, that's a big deal. To know that you can actually do without drink the things that it took drink to make you do is a real deal. Because you come out of that state. If you come out of alcoholism at the age of 40, say, and you went in at 20, you're still 20 somewhere in your emotions and so on. So it's a long journey. But the point I'm coming to really was that this was my first awakening to something, which is really to myself. I mean, for the first time since my childhood, I became aware of myself as different to the version that was being given to me all around, that was coming at me from the culture, from the bunker. And I was beginning to understand, I could see that fundamentally I had been given a version of myself that was coherent, that worked, whereas the other ones didn't, that this one hung together. And so I said, well, if I've been wrong about all that stuff, what else am I wrong about? Maybe a lot of the stuff that I've kind of dismissed might be worth looking at again. So I started to open up, I guess, and one of the symptoms of actually hanging around with these people who have no problem talking about God is that you kind of have no choice but to open up because they are. And so you start to talk about things you wouldn't have dreamt about talking about before. And you don't tend to meet the people you used to drink with anymore, so you don't kind of get drawn into that kind of cynical thing that happens in pubs and all that. So, and then gradually I started to write out of this experience and to start observing reality in this way. And somebody said to me today that they met somebody who knew me in Dublin, and they asked him about me, and he said, "Oh, that guy, he's just a contrarian." And that's very interesting because it means that you actually see things differently. They think there's only one way. I say, and a contrarian is a good thing to be in the bunker because it means you can see the bunker, but you know it isn't the entirety of reality. And that's kind of what I'm talking about. This is the beginning of this discovery. So from then I started, as I say, to get curious. And I mean, part of the whole alcohol thing, and particularly when you're a journalist, it cuts you off a little bit from your colleagues because they all meet in pubs. And I found all kinds of interesting things, that I was no longer kind of being policed by my colleagues in terms of what I could believe or what I could say. And therefore I was free to say things that I wouldn't have said previously. or to think things to myself even that I wouldn't have thought previously, that I would have arrested at the very moment of emergence. And so that was the beginning of my freedom as well. So there you have desire and freedom. And then after that, satisfaction, that's the title, so let's go with it. You know, I have a daughter, Roisin, who's now 16. She'll be 17 in March. And really her life has been a great grace for me because it gave me a second chance to look at reality. Because I could see it through her eyes, and I saw it on her behalf in lots of different ways, all along the way, whether it was to do with educating her or, you know, to do with music or whatever it was. And we had many great experiences, and still have, and will have, I hope, please God. But I remember the very first, I mean, for example, the very first experience, the very first lesson was really, for me with Roisin, was she was only maybe a couple of weeks old. And she'd been living in London, and suddenly she was with me in Dublin. And her mother and I were not together. And so we were in the house, my house, just me and Roisin. And she was staying overnight. And she was just a baby, a few weeks old. I'd never done anything like this before in my life. And I was quite frightened. But I had the support of friends and Alcoholics Anonymous and all of that, who helped me reason this through. But I remember the first night taking her to her basket, and it was the same basket that I'd been in as a child, and I put her down, and then I kind of backed towards the door, and I stood there waiting and watching, and I couldn't leave the room. And I stood there for an hour or more, like just staring at her and thinking, what am I going to do? You know, I have to stay here. What if something happens to her? What if she gets ill? What if, you know, if I fall asleep and she's crying out for me? I have to stay here. And then the next thought that came to me after a while was, do I keep her alive? You know, I don't even keep myself alive, so how can I keep her alive? Go to bed so you can look after her tomorrow. So I did, and that was the first lesson. And all the time, all the way along the way, she's been teaching me these really central lessons, reflecting back at me, my own experience, and the way I dealt with stuff as a child, and so on. But I remember actually her also giving me my first glimpse of freedom, of the real idea of freedom, because I've talked about the 60s idea of freedom, which is really go after what you think you want, follow your instincts, take what you can, hang the consequences. You know, consequences are all to do with inhibitions and taboos and all those outmoded kind of ideas. You can transcend all that by being free in this way. And this hadn't worked for me, as I said, but still it kind of, you know, you live in the bunker, so the bunker invades you and stays in you. You know, let's not, you know, you don't suddenly become holy and stay holy and you know, start smiling condescendingly at people who are struggling around you. You know, I'm still struggling. I understand these things. Please don't think that just because I understand them means I do them all the time, or you can have access to what I say every moment of my life. I can't. It comes and goes. I need to keep reminding myself. I need to renew it every moment, every day. But this time anyway, I remember actually having this understanding, because we had a very strange kind of a sequence of custody, which was kind of on a fortnightly basis, 5 days, then 2 days off, then 2 days on, then 5 days off. So 5-2-2-5, and that meant really essentially one long weekend every fortnight, and then 2 days in the middle of the other week. And I noticed a pattern in myself in the early stages that, you know, much as I adored Roisin and much as I loved having her with me, that there was a kind of a fear building up, an anxiety building up in me when she was due to come, because of the responsibility and also the sense of being trapped, of not being able to get away, of having to be obedient to her presence and to the responsibility that I had for her, which I had no problem with, but it's just that this uneasiness used to creep into me. And then she would come and I would relax a little bit, and then we'd get on with, you know, cooking for her and reading stories, all that. I didn't think much about it other than that. And then I would find myself looking forward to the weekend off. And I would drop her on a Friday morning to school, facing 5 days without her and supposedly free. And I would drop her, and then I would go home, and I would sit down and have a cup of tea and look out the window. And I would sit there for several hours, feeling nothing but loneliness, feeling no sense of freedom, no sense of, yippee, here we go. I just wanted her back, because what I wanted was all those moments when I was cooking for her and cleaning and reading her stories and talking to her. That was my freedom. And that really made me aware of something different here. There's a different freedom. There's a different freedom here, which Stanley talks about, is the freedom to follow your destination, to follow your path to the destination, right? Aim towards the horizon and keep walking. And that's the real freedom. That's what I learned from Roisin, one of the things I learned from her. But the bunker is really, I think for us, the most important metaphor that we can absorb in the modern era. To be aware of this bunker, whether it's, if we think of this building as a bunker, or it doesn't have to be like that, but your mind can be a bunker. Your car can be a bunker. The church can be a bunker. That to be aware that it's there. Because there's something happening to us that is very strange. I often say that if I work in the media and journalists and others in the media always resent when you say critical things about them. You're supposed only to pretend that everything is perfect. But I always try and say, well, look, there are problems here. I mean, if you were to sit down here in this building 60 years ago, 70 years ago, I don't know, maybe in America, I'm talking about Ireland really, and imagine the advent of a mass media society, a society in which you have radio, television, 24/7, you have the internet, you have Facebook, Twitter, all that stuff, so that there is nothing, almost no conceivable other means of communication that you could devise. And if you were to imagine that, I think you'd probably imagine something like this, that, wow, it's going to be extraordinary. It's going to be like everything we feel and know and think, we'll be able to share that and to ask questions of one another and verify our most fundamental needs and questions and desires and check it out against each other. But actually something close to the opposite has happened, that there's a different process that actually happens as a result of media, that actually all the energy comes towards you. It doesn't come out, it comes towards you. Even when you're on Facebook or Twitter, I think, that you are actually regurgitating that which is already permitted, that which is already agreed. So you kind of, there's a sense in which we're cut off somewhere here above the heart. C.S. Lewis had a great phrase, for this: men without chests. It's like that our heads are in a cloud that is what Gisani called the common mentality. And we share what is there in that culture, what is permitted, what is agreed, what goes around that culture. But we never are permitted to expose what is in the heart, with the result that each of us thinks that I alone, have these needs, these thoughts, these feelings. And this is a symptom of the bunker as well, that we need to kind of make visible to ourselves so we understand that we are divided in two. Not so much between head and heart, but between what we say to the common mentality and what we would love to say from the heart of ourselves. And this is actually really the core symptom of the bunker. So that so much happens that we can't express. And only occasionally do we get a clue that maybe some other person, through a witness, through just maybe a gesture, expression, some other person shares something deep within us. And for all the media, all the communication that we do and have, it's not possible. It should be possible, but it's not possible to make this visible to all. And this is a real problem in our culture, because it actually has to do with this idea, Monsignor Albacete on Friday night talked about this virus And this is a wonderful metaphor as well for this, because it really, as he said, it doesn't attack God, it attacks us. It attacks our humanity. And it does some, but to see what it does to us, what does it do? It divides us against ourselves. It causes us to put to sleep what we are, our fundamental nature. That's the nature. That's what I did to become an alcoholic. I put to sleep what I was, what I am. So we do this all the time. It's kind of like our condition. And we kind of therefore think, I mean, I find when I talk to our people in Ireland about, I go around the country and I talk to maybe small enough audiences, maybe 100, 200 people, and lots of them are parents, and they really have, they come, the grief is on their faces, really, because they have children and they can't guide their children, they can't educate their children into a religious view of reality, because it seems that the religious view of reality has been superseded by events. That for all that they want to cling on to this, for all they love it, for all they love the church, they love Christ, they love all of these things, it just doesn't seem to make sense. They can't find words that aren't laughable in some way to communicate these to their children. And they sound hollow the minute they utter them. And what's this? It's this process, you know, that the language of the common mentality is one thing, the language of the heart is another. We can't express this language. There are no words anymore to give voice in the public square to these deepest needs, except, you know, in places like this. And so we have this idea, you know, at the core of our culture. It's like, you know, there has been, like, you know, when I was a kid, we used to read the comics, and they had the speech bubbles and thought bubbles. And I think of this as kind of reality as being like now, that there's two speech bubbles, you know, which, if you like, is fact and fiction, or reality and, you know, superstition, maybe. And in between, there's a kind of a thought bubble, which is where we put everything religious. And it's neither one nor the other. It's neither fact nor fiction. It's like a complete fudge, a complete evasion, that we don't believe it, but we don't disbelieve it. It just doesn't seem to be real, but we haven't the heart to say we don't believe it. But I say to them that when I was a child in school, the first question in the catechism for First Communion was, who made the world? And the answer was, God made the world. And that was it. And I was always a bit irritated by this question as a child, because I kind of thought it's a bit superfluous to ask such a question. Now I'm not so sure. But I said, you know, I've racked my brains, and there's only two answers that you can give to this question. Did God make the world, yes or no? I've racked my brains, and there isn't a third answer. He either made the world or he didn't make the world. So why are we behaving as if it's neither one or the other? Why do we behave as if there's some third way of seeing this? Which is another trick the bunker plays. You know, we're allowed to keep our rituals. We're allowed to keep our loyalty to certain religious traditions up to a point, so long as we don't take them too seriously. And this is something that you see in the media all the time, whereby people are asked their questions about what do you believe in, but you can tell that the answer is not being listened to seriously. It's not being pursued as a real answer to a real question. It's almost like as if it's just some personal eccentricity that it might be interesting to some people out there, who knows. So all these symptoms we need to make visible to ourselves so we understand the conditions that we work in, we live in. Because that's what's actually doing to us, what's happening to us. And to finish, I want to tell you just about Roisin again. There was one moment 2 years ago when Roisin was 13. And Roisin was always somebody who had an infinite curiosity and an infinite desire for reality. She wanted to eat everything, to eat the world, and drink the world, and just consume it. And she always had no question. Like me as a child, she had no doubt. She didn't need faith because God existed. But she also loved science, even as a very young child, and the stars and all that stuff. And she was forever looking at books and pictures of the Milky Way and all that stuff. And I remember when she was doing her first communion, I picked her up from school one day and said to her, Roisin, on the way back, I said, do you have any problem, Roisin, reconciling what you're learning in catechism class with what you know about science? And she said, why should I? I said, well, if God made the world in 7 days, she said, he made it in 6 days. Okay, 6 days. If he made it in 6 days, right? Where does that leave the Big Bang? All that stuff. I mean, if Genesis is true, how can the Big Bang be true also? She said, who made the Big Bang? And this is really the most, I think, the sharpest and most profound answer I've ever got to this question from anybody, philosopher or otherwise. But then 2 years ago, I remember being out for lunch one day in Spain with herself and my 2 nephews, and they're kind of fairly orthodox Irish young Catholics, which means they know nothing about anything. And they were talking about Catholicism and the church, and it was all pretty negative stuff. And I could see Roisin had kind of gathered into herself and was very quiet. And that night I was going to bed, and she knocked on my bedroom door, and she came in tears. And she said, Dad, I'm terrified. I'm terrified that there's nothing. I'm terrified that when we die, that's it. That you're gone, I'm gone, we're all gone. We'll never see each other again. And this is a kind of a moment that I had anticipated really for many years. It's a moment that we all as parents face. But I hadn't prepared. I mean, it's a strange thing. You expect something, but you don't prepare. No. And I knew, it was one of those nanoseconds where everything passes through your mind. It just shows you the capacity of the mind, the universe that the mind is, where it can process all of the possibilities and all of the, non-possibilities. And I knew instantly that if I came up with a piety or a platitude at this moment, I was dead. It was over. But I was blessed that I had read The Religious Sense by Don Giussani. And I'd read, in particular, that paragraph at the beginning of chapter 10, which is the method that effectively, he doesn't use the term, but this is what it is, where Giussani teaches us how to emerge from the bunker at any moment. He gives us the method, the ticket out of the bunker. And he says, I want you to close your eyes and imagine you're just being born. And I want you to bring with you, I'm paraphrasing, but you know the paragraph, some of you will know the paragraph. I want you to bring to that moment all of the intelligence and experience and intuition and emotion, everything you use to apprehend reality now, go there with that. And I want to ask you, what do you think? And he says, there are only 2 responses you can have. One is astonishment. Astonishment that there are beings and things and colors and lights and movement. Astonishment. And the other is the thought, I didn't make any of this. I didn't make myself. I don't know where this stuff came from. This is the original wonder of being human that we have lost in our culture, in the bunker. So this came to me, but I knew that it was kind of a bit abstract. And it kind of would sound a bit like a sermon, and I wanted to kind of make it particular to Roisin. So I said to her, I had another intuition, and I kind of did a little bit of improvisation around Giussani's theme. A bit of a riff, I just took it and did a jam around it. And I said, Roisin, I want you to go back to the day you were born, which was the 10th of March, 1996. And I don't want you to stop there, I want you to go 9 months before that, to the day you were conceived. Let's say that was the 10th of June, 1995. And I want you to go one day further back now, to the day before you were conceived. I want you to go to the place that you're afraid of, that you've been told should dominate your awareness and your consciousness, that has made you come in here tonight tearful. This nothingness, or whatever you think it is, this abyss. I want you to go there, that you came from, you think. And bring all your intelligence, your experience, everything, your words, everything, bring it all there. And I want to ask you one question. What do you think is possible? What do you think is possible? Is Spain possible? Is the Mediterranean possible? Am I possible? Are you possible? And she said, no, nothing is possible. I said, but here you are. Here we are. We're possible because we're here. So, you have come, you think, or you're being told, from nothing, and you're in something, and all you can think of is nothing. What kind of reasoning is that? Who taught you to think like this? Who taught you that this is a reasonable way to look at reality? To be surrounded by everything and to think of nothing. This is what the bunker does to our children and to us. This is the effect of all of these different elements, and I've only tried to sketch a few for you. This is where we end up. Confusing skepticism for rationalism, pessimism for logic, despair for intelligence. So, to finish, because I saw the note, I'm grateful to Pope Benedict for this beautiful image, which I have written a song around in my head. And because it seems to me that he has drawn our attention to the three most fundamental things we need to pay attention to living in this culture of the bunker. One is, there is a bunker. Two is, we are in the bunker. Three is, there is another place. Thank you.
Thanks, John. I wish we could continue because being with John this evening has been another sign, another little experience of freedom. In the experience of freedom, though, even the president can get a yellow card, so I had to stop it. But I was thinking, as he was concluding, something that we said last year at the very beginning, you know, this place as a home, which is the same thing that Venice Thomas sang on the first night, that longing for a place where freedom can be, when freedom can happen, when this virus that breaks us in two is defeated. Forget definitions, as Monsignor Abaseta told us Friday evening. I know that I feel free when I'm happy. And I know that I'm happy when I'm fulfilled. And I do know, as John told us so tenderly, describing his relationship with his daughter, I'm fulfilled only in an experience of love. And an experience of love implies the existence, the presence of another. To experience freedom, I need another. That's all I can say, but that's something we all saw in these 3 days here together, and that we'll see again tonight with the music, jazz music, a free expression, where everybody's called to be what has been given, and at the same time, that makes sense only in the awareness of a belonging. So, you know, I wish I could find the words to wrap this all up. But I don't have to worry about that much. I can turn to Father Giussani, and I will read you something that he said. The first one, in a way, very short, don't worry, is a description of what John was telling us, or what Monsignor Albacete reminded us. Giussani says, when the grip of a hostile society tightens around us to the point of threatening the vivacity of our expression, and when a cultural and social hegemony tends to penetrate the heart, stirring up our already natural uncertainties, then the time of the person has come. But then the question I ask myself, how does the person come back to life? How did John come back to life? And this is Father Giussani again. Where can I find my original identity? Where can I be free? Where can I be myself? The answer that I'm about to give not only fits the current situation, but it's a rule, a universal law, since the beginning until the end of human existence. People, we, regain themselves in a living encounter. That is, by means of bumping into a presence that stirs an attraction and provokes them to recognize that their heart, with the needs of which it is made, does exist. Am I possible? Do I exist? The I, again, finds itself in an encounter with the presence that carries this statement. What your heart is made for does exist. You see me, for example, that it exists. We saw during the New York encounter that this mysterious presence is visible. Don't get me wrong. And this is Giussani again, and with this I end. Expecting complete happiness in life, and we could say expecting complete freedom in life, is a dream. Living life as a journey to happiness, living life as a journey to freedom is an ideal. And it is beautiful, and it is possible, and that's what we experienced with together. Thanks, John. Thanks, everybody.